The boardroom glass reflected a skyline that did not yet know it was in trouble. On the table lay inspection reports marked in red. Micro-cracking along the eastern load-bearing columns. Stress displacement readings above acceptable thresholds. The Langford Tower project, Victoria Lang's flagship development, was 3 days from its grand investor gala. Victoria stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly against polished wood. "We cannot postpone Sunday," she said evenly. "The investors are flying in from Zurich and Singapore. The press has already been scheduled." Around the table, executives shifted in controlled discomfort. The chief consultant cleared his throat. "The stress fractures are contained for now, but we can't guarantee stability under full occupancy load without additional reinforcement." "How long?" Victoria asked. 2 weeks minimum." A silence followed. 2 weeks was not an answer. Her gaze moved slowly around the table before settling on David Carter, seated near the far end with a binder open in front of him. David had been the original structural engineer on the tower's early design phase, before budget revisions shifted authority upward. He had said little during the previous hour. "David," Victoria said. He looked up. "I need a man by Sunday." The phrasing hung in the air, deliberate and sharp. A few executives smiled reflexively. One chuckled under his breath. Victoria continued, tone measured but edged. "I need someone who can walk into that building, solve this problem, and ensure that when the lights come on Sunday night, nothing moves." David did not react to the laughter. He closed the binder gently and folded his hands. "What's been altered since the original load model?" he asked calmly. The chief consultant answered. "We streamlined the reinforcement lattice during Phase 2. For efficiency," another executive added. David nodded once. Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Can you fix it?" He met her gaze without tension. "Yes." "How?" "Restore the original load distribution grid." A murmur moved around the table. "That would require reopening structural panels," the consultant objected. "We already replaced the initial reinforcement system with a lighter alternative," David replied. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're saying the simplification caused this?" "I'm saying stress doesn't disappear because we decide it's inconvenient." Silence settled more heavily this time. Victoria straightened. "You have 48 hours." He nodded once. "No delays?" she added. "No delays," he agreed. The meeting adjourned with uneasy efficiency. Executives gathered their folders. Consultants whispered about temporary bracing. David remained seated for a moment longer before rising. As he left the boardroom, he passed the architectural rendering mounted on the wall, the sleek glass tower framed against a bright sky. No one in that room realized that the structural failure they were scrambling to contain traced directly back to a decision made 18 months earlier. The day Victoria's team removed his original reinforcement designed to cut material costs. They called it optimization. He called it imbalance. And by Sunday, the building would either stand or prove him right. The kitchen clock read 7:03 p.m. when David stepped through the front door. The house was small but deliberate. A narrow hallway led into a modest kitchen lit by a single overhead fixture that hummed faintly. The air smelled like tomato soup and toasted bread. No glass walls. No red-marked reports. No skyline waiting to collapse. Lily sat at the table with her math workbook open and a pencil tucked behind one ear. Her stuffed owl leaned against a glass of milk, watching the room with permanent stitched calm. "You're late," she said, though her voice carried no accusation. "I had to finish something," David replied. She studied him carefully. "You look tired." He set his briefcase on the counter and loosened his tie slightly. "Big buildings," he said, "can be stubborn." "Like people?" she asked. "Sometimes." She pushed her workbook aside. "Did it fall down?" "No." "Will it?" He walked to the stove and stirred the soup slowly before answering. "Not if it's balanced." She frowned slightly. "Balanced like my bike?" "Yes." "When you said if I lean too far I fall?" "Exactly." She nodded as if the logic was complete. David carried 2 bowls to the table and sat across from her. The kitchen window reflected their silhouettes faintly against the darkening street outside. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, Langford Tower's glass exterior caught the last light of evening. "What makes a building fall?" Lily asked. "Pressure in the wrong place." She considered that quietly. He did not mention the meeting. He did not repeat Victoria's words. Instead, he reached for a napkin and folded it once, then again. "When something holds too much weight in one spot," he continued, "the rest of it feels it. Like when I carry all my books in one hand?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. The simplicity of her question steadied him. Under the kitchen light, there were no consultants, no investors, no deadline breathing down the walls. Just balance. After dinner, Lily slid off her chair and grabbed a crayon from the counter. She began sketching a tall rectangle on the back of her math worksheet. "That's your building," she said. He leaned closer. She drew small lines across it to represent windows. "It doesn't fall," she added firmly. He nodded. "It won't." She tilted her head. "How do you know?" David paused. "Because I designed it that way." But he didn't say that aloud. Instead, he replied, "Because I know where the weight should go." She seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to coloring. When she went to brush her teeth, David remained at the table for a moment longer. He could see the stress diagram in his mind without opening a file. The eastern load-bearing columns had been simplified during cost revision. The secondary reinforcement lattice he originally installed had been replaced with a lighter grid. The micro cracks were not random. They followed a pattern. He finished his tea and rose. Upstairs, Lily's bedroom light flicked off. In the quiet of the house, far removed from the boardroom's sharp edges, David understood something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. He already knew exactly what was wrong with the building. And he knew precisely how to fix it. 10 years earlier, the Langford Tower existed only as graphite lines on drafting tables, scale models suspended under harsh fluorescent lights, and arguments that lasted long after the cleaning crews had emptied the trash bins. David Carter was 34 then, the youngest lead structural engineer the firm had ever promoted, though he never mentioned the distinction. He didn't design for spectacle. He designed for equilibrium. The original reinforcement system he drafted was built around a principle most developers dismissed as unnecessary expense: distributed load absorption. Instead of relying solely on vertical column strength to bear weight, David integrated a secondary lattice into the floor plates, a network of diagonal tension channels that redirected shear stress before it could accumulate at critical junctions. He called it the tri-node redistribution grid. The geometry was subtle. From the outside, the building would look identical to any other glass high-rise. But inside the concrete and steel, the lattice acted like a nervous system, sensing pressure shifts and dispersing them across multiple pathways. If one column took excessive load, the grid transferred force to adjacent supports before distortion could set in. During the initial review, David ran a live stress test on the digital model. He increased the lateral wind load until the conventional frame turned red with critical stress. Then he activated the grid. The red faded to green as force redistributed evenly across the structure. A senior partner leaned forward and said, "That's not just reinforcement. That's intelligence." The board approved the initial phase. David's initials appeared in the lower right corner of the master blueprint, small and unadorned. MC. Then Claire fell ill. The diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday morning. A sudden vascular condition that moved faster than the specialists could contain. David spent the next 3 weeks in hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. He brought drafting pencils to the waiting room, sketching load paths on napkins just to keep his hands steady. The numbers offered a kind of order that life no longer provided. The funeral was held on a gray afternoon in November. Lily was 4. She held David's hand with a grip that felt older than her years. David returned to the office 2 weeks later because the silence at home was heavier than the noise at work. But his focus had shifted. The aggressive ambition that once drove him toward leadership roles no longer mattered. He needed stability. He needed to be present when Lily woke from nightmares. He needed to leave by 5:30. When the firm offered him the role of vice president of engineering, he declined. "I can't travel," he told the board. "I can't work 80-hour weeks. Not right now." They accepted his decision but reassigned project leadership to a director who prioritized schedule compression. Restructuring followed within the year. New executives arrived with spreadsheets that highlighted margin acceleration. The tri-node grid was flagged during a cost reduction review. "Redundant," one analyst said, pointing at the material cost column. "The primary columns meet code without the secondary channels. We're paying for steel that doesn't show." David sat in the back of the value engineering meeting, hands folded. The new director used terms like lean construction and market-responsive design. When David raised his hand to mention cyclic fatigue, the director smiled politely. "David, we appreciate your thoroughness, but the market doesn't pay for invisible insurance." The room nodded. The decision was made before David finished his sentence. He submitted a technical memo the next day. He outlined the risk of micro-fatigue under sustained cyclic load. He mapped exactly where stress would concentrate if the lattice was removed. He included simulation overlays showing how the simplified design would develop hairline fractures along the eastern elevation after 18 months of occupancy. The memo was acknowledged in an email thread that ended with, "Noted. Proceed with value engineering." The revised blueprint eliminated the diagonal channels. Steel weight was reduced by 12%. Fabrication time shortened by 3 weeks. The project moved forward faster. Profit projections improved. David watched the changes from his desk in the corner office he no longer occupied. He did not protest publicly. He did not threaten to resign. He understood the arithmetic that drove the decision. He also understood that arguing with cost analysts about physics was like arguing with gravity. But he preserved the truth. In the months that followed, David spent evenings at the kitchen table with Lily asleep down the hall. He would unfold the original blueprints and check the calculations again, not because he doubted them, but because the geometry offered a quiet reminder that some things could still be balanced. If load equals resistance, the structure holds. It was a small comfort. When the final design files were transferred to the construction team, David requested a copy of the original schematics for his personal archives. The request was granted without scrutiny. Executives assumed he wanted a memento of his early work. He didn't. He wanted the geometry that worked. He stored the blueprints in a flat file drawer beneath his kitchen table, folded carefully along the original creases. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the lines remained sharp. The load paths were clear. The reinforcement lattice he had designed was still intact on paper, even as the building rose without it. Now, standing in his kitchen years later, David could still trace the grid in his mind. He knew exactly where the micro cracks had appeared. He knew why the eastern columns were failing. And he knew the original blueprints still existed. He had kept the copies. And they held the only solution that would save the tower. By Friday morning, the inspection reports no longer used cautious language. Hairline fractures had been documented along the eastern load-bearing columns from levels 23 through 31. At first, they were dismissed as surface imperfections in the concrete finish. Then the stress scans came back. The micro cracks weren't superficial. They followed a pattern. In the executive conference room, consultants projected thermal imaging overlays and structural stress simulations against the wall. The eastern elevation glowed faintly where pressure had accumulated over time. "We can apply fiber-reinforced surface bands," one consultant suggested. "Cosmetic reinforcement. It will pass visual inspection for Sunday." "Temporary?" another executive asked. "Stabilizing," the consultant replied. Victoria Lang sat at the head of the table, her posture as sharp as the skyline outside. "The gala is not negotiable," she said. "We have investors flying in from 3 continents." David remained silent for most of the presentation. He studied the stress overlay rather than the room. The pattern was exactly where he expected it to be. The secondary reinforcement lattice that once redistributed load across that elevation was absent. Without it, stress migrated vertically until it found the narrowest margin of resistance. "That solution won't hold," David said quietly. The consultant glanced toward him. "It will stabilize surface fractures. It won't redistribute load." Another executive leaned forward. "We don't have time to reopen structural panels." "You don't have time not to," David replied. A few heads turned. Victoria's gaze settled on him again. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Full access to the eastern column cores," he said. "We remove the simplified bracing and reinstall the original redistribution grid." The room tightened. "That would require drilling through finished walls," the operations director objected. "We just installed imported marble in the lobby. The marble won't matter if the structure shifts," David said evenly. One of the financial officers tapped a pen against his notebook. "What's the probability of full failure?" David paused. "Not collapse," he said. "Distortion." "And the difference?" Victoria asked. "Reputation." Silence followed. The consultants exchanged looks. "We can conceal the fractures with reinforcement mesh," one insisted. "It will photograph clean." David shook his head slightly. "You're treating symptoms," he said. "The load is accumulating beneath." Victoria rose from her chair and walked to the projected stress map. She studied the eastern glow, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. "You're saying this traces back to design revision?" she said. "Yes." "Prove it. Give me access." She considered the cost, not just in materials, but in optics. Closing portions of the tower days before the gala would signal instability. Investors disliked instability more than they disliked delay. "What do you need?" she asked finally. 48 hours, David replied. "An unrestricted structural clearance." The operations director exhaled sharply. "We can't tear open half the building before Sunday." David met his gaze calmly. "You won't need half." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "Fine," she said. "You have access." The consultants began gathering their files. David remained seated. He wasn't relieved. He was calculating. As the room emptied, he looked once more at the stress map glowing faintly against the skyline. The cracks they had discovered were not the full extent of the damage. They were just the visible evidence. The load beneath was heavier than anyone in that room realized. And if he was right, Sunday wouldn't expose surface fractures. It would expose something much worse. The tower was quiet when David stepped into it after midnight. Construction crews had been dismissed. Consultants had retreated to their hotels. The lobby lights remained on for security, casting long reflections across marble floors that would soon be drilled open. He didn't look at the marble. He looked up. Level 23 was the starting point. By 1:17 a.m., David stood inside an exposed service corridor behind the eastern elevation. The simplified bracing system installed during value engineering was visible once the wall panels were removed. The steel members were lighter than his original specification. Efficient on paper. Incomplete under load. He ran his hand along the column. The vibration was subtle but present, pressure migrating without redistribution. He turned to the structural crew he had assembled quietly from former colleagues and trusted site engineers. "We reinstalled the grid," he said. They nodded. The original reinforcement lattice had not been discarded entirely. Portions remained in archived storage for early phases of the project. David had arranged retrieval before requesting access. By 3 a.m., steel channels were lifted into position along the eastern column span. The diagonal tension members intersected at calculated angles designed to redistribute stress across adjacent load points. He adjusted the placement by half an inch. "No shortcuts," he said. The crew worked without chatter. By sunrise, 3 levels had been reinforced. The tension ratios were recalibrated manually, measured against the original blueprint David had unfolded on a portable drafting table. He drank coffee from a paper cup and recalculated load dispersion with a pencil rather than relying solely on digital models. At 9 a.m., Victoria arrived on site. She walked the exposed corridor silently. "How long?" she asked. "Until it's balanced," he replied. She did not argue. By Saturday afternoon, 8 levels were complete. The micro cracks visible along the eastern interior wall ceased expanding. Stress readings began to flatten. But David knew stabilization wasn't proof. Simulation would be. At 6:40 p.m., he ordered the first incremental stress test. The building's HVAC system was engaged at full load. Elevator shafts were activated. Simulated occupancy weight was added through calibrated mechanical ballast. The stress monitors climbed. The eastern elevation glowed faintly on the screen. Then the curve flattened. Not dramatically. Gradually. "Again," David said. They increased the load beyond projected Sunday gala capacity. The tension grid absorbed the force, redistributing pressure across the lattice rather than concentrating it. By midnight, 12 levels were fully reinforced. The crew was exhausted. David remained steady. On Sunday morning, 6 hours before the investor gala, the final reinforcement segment was secured. He reviewed the tension rat. The original reinforcement lattice had not been discarded entirely. Portions remained in archived storage for early phases of the project. David had arranged retrieval before requesting access. By 3 a.m., steel channels were lifted into position along the eastern column span. The diagonal tension members intersected at calculated angles designed to redistribute stress across adjacent load points. He adjusted the placement by half an inch. "No shortcuts," he said. The crew worked without chatter. By sunrise, 3 levels had been reinforced. The tension ratios were recalibrated manually, measured against the original blueprint David had unfolded on a portable drafting table. He drank coffee from a paper cup and recalculated load dispersion with a pencil rather than relying solely on digital models. At 9 a.m., Victoria arrived on site. She walked the exposed corridor silently. "How long?" she asked. "Until it's balanced," he replied. She did not argue. By Saturday afternoon, 8 levels were complete. The micro cracks visible along the eastern interior wall ceased expanding. Stress readings began to flatten. But David knew stabilization wasn't proof. Simulation would be. At 6:40 p.m., he ordered the first incremental stress test. The building's HVAC system was engaged at full load. Elevator shafts were activated. Simulated occupancy weight was added through calibrated mechanical ballast. The stress monitors climbed. The eastern elevation glowed faintly on the screen. Then the curve flattened. Not dramatically. Gradually. "Again," David said. They increased the load beyond projected Sunday gala capacity. The tension grid absorbed the force, redistributing pressure across the lattice rather than concentrating it. By midnight, 12 levels were fully reinforced. The crew was exhausted. David remained steady. On Sunday morning, 6 hours before the investor gala, the final reinforcement segment was secured. The room beneath the marble floor hummed softly as the steel absorbed force. An analyst glanced at David. "Stable," he said under his breath. Victoria kept her eyes on the monitor. Load increased again, intentionally beyond projected gala capacity. ## Part 12. The system held. The tension ratios remained within tolerance. Across the ballroom, investors applauded a speech celebrating Langford Tower as a symbol of precision engineering. They had no idea how literal that statement had become. The final simulation phase engaged. The building absorbed full peak stress. No acceleration in crack growth. No distortion in column alignment. The lattice grid carried the weight quietly, invisibly. The monitor displayed a single word. Balanced. Victoria exhaled for the first time since the weekend began. "It's holding," she said. "Yes." The consultant who had suggested cosmetic reinforcement stepped closer to the display. He studied the curve carefully. This matches the original structural model, he admitted. David folded his hands calmly. It always did. Victoria glanced toward him. Pull the revision log, she said to the analyst. The archived documentation surfaced on the secondary screen, structural modification approval forms from 18 months earlier. The signature authorizing simplification of the reinforcement lattice was displayed clearly. Victoria Hale. The room fell silent. She read the date twice. The cost reduction directive had originated in her office. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Proceed with the gala, she said evenly. The atrium lights brightened as the keynote address concluded. Investors toasted to growth projections and expansion plans. Above them, the steel grid redistributed load without complaint. The building did not creak. It did not shift. It performed exactly as originally intended. Victoria looked back at the revision log one more time before closing the screen. The tension curves had stabilized. The structure held. And she now understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit. The failure had never been engineering. It had been judgment. The gala ended in applause and glassware clinking softly beneath the atrium lights. By 10:42 p.m., the investors had left. The ballroom staff began dismantling floral arrangements. The skyline beyond the glass reflected calm certainty. Victoria found David standing alone near the eastern corridor where the reinforcement lattice ran hidden beneath polished marble. "Walk with me," she said. They moved away from the fading noise into a quiet service hallway. She stopped first. "The simplification order came from my office," she said. David nodded once. "Yes. You didn't say anything. I submitted a memo." She exhaled. "I signed it." "Yes." There was no accusation in his tone. Only confirmation. Victoria looked down the corridor toward the concealed steel beams. "I thought we were optimizing," she said. "You were accelerating. And you disagreed. I documented the risk." She glanced at him sharply. "You could have made tonight uncomfortable. That wouldn't have changed the structure." The silence that followed was not defensive. It was reflective. "Balance," she said slowly. "You keep using that word. It's not a metaphor." He stepped closer to the corridor wall and placed his hand against it. "You can remove visible material and still meet code. But stress doesn't disappear. It migrates." She listened. "When you simplify for convenience," he continued, "you don't eliminate weight. You shift it." Victoria folded her arms lightly. "I need you here," she said. "For how long?" "As long as it takes to ensure this doesn't happen again." David considered that. "I won't stay as a consultant." "What do you want?" "Structural oversight authority," he said evenly. "No reinforcement design can be altered without full engineering review and written acknowledgement of long-term stress impact. That challenges executive discretion. It protects the building." She studied him carefully. "And if the board resists?" "They won't." She allowed herself a faint, humorless smile. "You're certain?" They saw the numbers. She looked toward the ballroom where cleanup crews moved quietly beneath the chandeliers. "You don't seem angry," she said. "Anger doesn't reinforce steel." The answer landed cleanly. "I asked you to be the man by Sunday," she said after a moment. "You asked for stability. And you delivered it." He didn't respond. "Stay," she said quietly. "Under those conditions." "Yes." They stood in silence for a moment longer. When Victoria returned to her office later that night, she drafted a policy revision proposal before exhaustion could dull her resolve. By morning, the board would receive documentation outlining permanent engineering oversight measures. The governance structure would change. Not because of public embarrassment. Because of structural truth. And for the first time since the tower's design was altered, balance would not be optional. Microhook, the board begins revising governance policies. The press conference was scheduled for noon the following day. Langford Tower stood gleaming behind the podium, its glass facade reflecting a skyline that now felt steadier than it had in weeks. Reporters gathered in the lobby, microphones aligned beneath banners celebrating the successful investor gala. Victoria Hale stepped forward without the prepared slide deck she usually favored. 2 days ago, she began, this building faced a structural vulnerability. There was no attempt to soften the language. That vulnerability was not caused by engineering incompetence. It was caused by a design simplification decision made during cost reduction. The room quieted. Behind her, a projection displayed a side-by-side comparison of the simplified reinforcement grid and the original tri-node redistribution lattice. The original reinforcement system for Langford Tower was designed by David Carter. She continued. It was modified during restructuring to reduce material expense. Cameras shifted toward David, who stood to the side of the podium, hands folded calmly. The restoration of that original lattice prevented further structural instability, she said. The building holds because its intended geometry was reinstated. A journalist raised a hand. Are you admitting executive error? Yes. The response was immediate. And what safeguards are being implemented to prevent similar compromises? Victoria nodded toward the projection screen. Effective immediately, all structural modifications within Langford developments will require independent engineering oversight. No cost-driven simplification of reinforcement systems will proceed without full long-term stress modeling review. The statement carried weight. We are revising governance protocols to ensure design integrity cannot be subordinated to short-term margin acceleration. Another reporter called out. Mr. Carter, how does it feel to have been right? David stepped forward only slightly. It feels balanced, he said evenly. The answer drew a few murmurs. You don't seem upset about how this unfolded, a journalist pressed. He paused briefly. The structure was corrected, he replied. That's the point. No mention of the earlier boardroom remark. No reference to the phrase, be the man. Victoria continued. David Carter has agreed to remain as senior structural architect under revised oversight authority. His original reinforcement model will remain intact for all future developments. The room absorbed the recalibration. No applause filled the lobby. Only recognition. Victoria stepped aside. David did not deliver a speech. He did not recount the late-night reinforcements, the hidden cracks, or the memo that had been filed and ignored. He simply stood beside the building as the skyline reflected off its surface. The cameras captured a quieter image this time, not confrontation, not triumph, but correction. When the conference concluded, the press dispersed gradually. Victoria approached David once more. You could have let this collapse, she said softly. It wouldn't have held, he replied. There was no sarcasm. Only fact. His revenge had not been humiliation. It had been structural precision restored. And precision, once corrected, did not require celebration. It required maintenance. The building stood. The system ran. And for the first time since the simplification decision, balance was no longer negotiable. David's office had once been at the end of a quiet hallway, behind a frosted glass door that separated leadership from the drafting tables below. When he returned to the executive floor after the press conference, the nameplate had been polished and reinstalled without ceremony. He removed it. Not the title. Just the door. By the end of the week, the frosted panel had been replaced with clear glass, and the door itself remained open. Engineers began stepping inside without knocking. At first, they came cautiously, junior staff who had never spoken to him directly, mid-level project managers who remembered his early work but had learned to defer to cost analysts instead. David did not deliver lectures. He unfolded the original reinforcement lattice blueprint across the table and asked simple questions. Where does the load migrate if this beam shifts? What happens if we remove this brace? Who signs off on that decision? They answered hesitantly at first. Then more confidently. He corrected angles with a pencil, not with authority. The office atmosphere shifted subtly. Meetings grew shorter. Technical reviews grew longer. The phrase value engineering began appearing less frequently in project summaries, replaced by long-term structural modeling. Victoria watched the shift from her corner office without interfering. She had expected resistance. There was none. David did not grandstand during executive meetings. He did not remind anyone of the gala night. He did not reference the memo that had been ignored. Instead, he asked for stress simulations before approving aesthetic changes. He insisted on independent review panels before material substitutions were made. He redirected budget discussions toward maintenance cycles rather than quarterly projections. The younger engineers noticed. They began staying later, not because they were pressured, but because they wanted to see how the geometry worked under sustained modeling. One afternoon, a junior structural analyst approached his desk. "I've been recalculating lateral load distribution on the east corridor," she said. "I think we can improve the secondary channel by half a degree." David nodded. "Show me." The adjustment was small. It mattered. Across the company, tones shifted quietly. Production managers began consulting engineering earlier in planning phases. Finance teams requested long-term fatigue projections before approving material substitutions. Contractors asked for clearer structural reasoning rather than accepting cosmetic reinforcement proposals. No memo declared the cultural shift. It happened in meetings where someone said, "Let's check the load path first." David continued arriving at the office before sunrise. He unlocked his computer, reviewed overnight simulation reports, and left his door open. He ate lunch at his desk or with the engineering team, rarely attending executive dining events. When reporters requested follow-up interviews about the tower incident, he declined politely. "The building speaks for itself," he said. Victoria observed the gradual change during a quarterly review session. Defect projections declined. Long-term maintenance costs flattened. Investor confidence steadied, not from spectacle, but from stability. One evening, as David prepared to leave, a project manager paused at his open door. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once. The office lights dimmed around them. He walked past the clear glass panel where his name once stood etched in frosted separation. The door remained open. And the structure of the company, like the tower itself, began to hold its weight differently. David unlocked the front door just before the sky turned fully violet. The house carried its usual evening quiet, soft kitchen light, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant rhythm of traffic beyond the neighborhood trees. Lily sat at the table with a sheet of paper covered in careful pencil lines. "You're early," she said. "Looks like it." She lifted the page toward him. It was a tall building drawn with straight sides and small square windows. At the bottom, she had written in uneven letters, "Doesn't fall." David studied the drawing without smiling broadly. "It's strong," she said confidently. "Yes." "Because it's balanced?" "Yes." She nodded, satisfied with the logic. He walked to the table and opened the drawer beneath it. Inside lay the original reinforcement blueprints, creased at the corners, graphite lines still sharp where the trinode redistribution lattice intersected in careful geometry. He placed Lily's drawing gently on top of them, aligning the edge with the old paper as precisely as he once aligned steel beams. Paper above paper. Design above memory. He closed the drawer softly. Outside, Langford Tower stood against the skyline, its glass reflecting the last light of the day. The stress monitors were quiet. The lattice grid carried weight invisibly. There were no cameras in the kitchen. No speeches waiting to be delivered. No music swelling in the background. Just a father and a daughter sitting at a scratched wooden table while evening settled in. Lily returned to her crayons. David leaned back in his chair and listened to the quiet. The building stood. The system held. And beneath both steel and paper, balance remained exactly where it was meant to be.